The observation station had been watching Earth for 63 years. It floated in the cold darkness near Neptune, hidden from human eyes by technology that bent light around its hull. Inside, Ambassador Al stood before a wall of screens showing the blue planet far away. He had 4 arms, skin, and eyes that had seen 400 years of life. He was old even by standards, and he had spent the last decade studying these strange creatures called humans. His report to the collective had been simple. Humans were primitive. They had only recently learned to travel between planets in their own system. They fought wars against each other. They polluted their world. They lived short, violent lives that rarely lasted a century. They were not worth contacting. But now everything had changed. The communication screen behind him flashed red. Al turned slowly, his twin hearts beating faster. He already knew what the message would say. The Eth swarm had broken through the outer colonies. The collective fleet had fallen at Hand Prime. 3 billion were dead, and the swarm was moving deeper into their space. Al closed his large black eyes for a moment. He had lived through peace. He had never known true war. None of his generation had. They had not fought a major conflict in 2,000 years. They had grown comfortable. They had grown weak. And now the Eth were coming. The swarm had appeared from the dark space between galaxies 50 years ago. They were not a single species but a collection of conquered races, all controlled by a central hive mind. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They consumed. Every world they touched was stripped of resources and life. Every species they encountered was either destroyed or absorbed into the swarm. They had watched from afar, hoping the swarm would turn away. They had sent diplomats who never returned. They had offered tribute that was ignored. And when the swarm finally came for them, they discovered that 2,000 years of peace had left them unable to fight. Al received his new orders an hour later. The High Council was desperate. They needed allies, resources, anything that might slow the swarm's advance, and the closest inhabited world was Earth. He was to make contact with the humans and beg for help. The old ambassador looked at the blue planet on his screen. He thought about what he knew of humans. They were aggressive. They were territorial. They had spent most of their history killing each other over land, resources, and ideas. Every scientist who had studied them agreed that humans were dangerous. But dangerous was exactly what the collective needed right now. Al began preparing his transmission. 3 days later, Commander Jake sat in the command chair of the Starship Resolute. He was 52 years old, with hair cut short, and a face marked by scars from the Mars Rebellion 15 years ago. He had been a soldier for 30 years. He had buried friends, led men into battle, and made decisions that haunted his dreams. He was tired in ways that sleep could not fix. The Resolute was on routine patrol near the edge of the solar system when the alien signal came through. Jake listened to it 3 times before he believed it was real. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. She was younger than Jake by 15 years, with sharp eyes and a mind that worked faster than anyone he had ever met. She had been his second in command for 5 years, and he trusted her completely. "It could be a trick," she said quietly. Jake shook his head. "Too elaborate, and the technology in that signal is beyond anything we have. If they wanted to attack us, they would not need to trick us first." He played the message again. The alien voice was strange, translated by some kind of computer into rough English. It spoke of a great enemy called the Eth. It spoke of worlds burning and billions dying. It begged for sanctuary and offered everything they had in return. And it warned that the enemy would follow. Lisa leaned closer to the screen. "If what they are saying is true, this swarm has destroyed civilizations far more advanced than us. What could we possibly do against something like that?" Jake did not answer immediately. He thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was 23 now, working as a doctor in Chicago. He thought about the cities, the farms, the oceans full of life. He thought about everything humanity had built after nearly destroying itself in the wars of the last century. "Maybe nothing," he finally said, "but I would rather know what is coming than be surprised by it." He opened a channel to Earth Command. Admiral Helen Torres answered personally. She was the highest-ranking officer in the United Earth Defense Force, a woman who had served through 3 wars and watched humanity pull itself back from the edge of extinction. Her face was calm as Jake explained what they had received, but he could see the tension in her eyes. "Send me everything," she said. "I will convene the council immediately." Jake ended the transmission and looked at Lisa. "Get us back to Earth, best speed." The Resolute turned toward home, engines burning bright against the darkness. In his observation station, Al waited for a response. He had little hope. Humans were primitive, selfish creatures who could barely stop fighting each other. Why would they risk themselves for aliens they had never met? But an hour later, a message arrived from Earth. It was short and direct, as humans seemed to prefer. "Message received. Representatives will meet with your delegation at the following coordinates. Do not approach Earth without escort." Al read the message several times. They had not refused. They had not run. They wanted to talk. Perhaps he had underestimated these humans. He began preparing his ship for the journey, not knowing that this first contact would change the galaxy forever. He did not know that the short-lived, primitive creatures he had dismissed for so long would soon make the mightiest empire in the known universe tremble with fear. He did not know that humanity was about to go to war. And when humans went to war, the universe had never seen anything like it. The United Earth Council met in Geneva, in a building that had once housed the old United Nations. The chamber was circular, with seats rising in tiers around a central platform. Representatives from every nation on Earth sat in those seats, their faces showing fear, confusion, and anger in equal measure. Admiral Helen Torres stood at the center of the platform. She was 64 years old, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much death. She had commanded ships in the Pacific War and led the defense of the lunar colonies during the Mars Rebellion. She had watched friends die and made choices that still woke her in the night, but she had never faced anything like this. The holographic display behind her showed images captured from the transmission. Massive ships that looked like living things, covered in dark chitin and glowing with sickly light. Worlds burning, their surfaces turned to ash. Bodies floating in the void, millions of them, belonging to species that no longer existed. The chamber was silent as the images played. When they ended, Admiral Torres spoke. "They have asked for our help. They are offering their technology, their knowledge, everything they have. In return, they want sanctuary for their people and our assistance against the Eth swarm." A representative from the European Federation stood immediately. His name was Hans, and he was known for his cautious approach to everything. "This is madness. You are asking us to fight an enemy that has destroyed civilizations thousands of years more advanced than us. We should close our borders and hope they pass us by." "They will not pass us by." General Chris rose from his seat in the military section. He was a large man with a quiet voice that somehow carried through the entire chamber. He had commanded ground forces for 20 years and had never lost a battle. "I have studied the data they provided. The swarm does not leave survivors. They do not ignore inhabited worlds. If they come to this part of the galaxy, they will find us. The only question is whether we will be ready." A woman from the African Union spoke next. Her name was Grace, and she represented the largest population block on Earth. "What can we possibly offer? We have 50 warships. They had thousands and they were destroyed." Admiral Torres nodded. "That is a fair question. Doctor, please present your analysis." Dr. Sam was the Council's chief scientific advisor. He was a thin man with nervous hands and a mind that worked in ways most people could not follow. He stepped onto the platform and activated a new display. "They were technologically superior to us in almost every way," he began. But they had not fought a war in 2,000 years. Their military tactics were outdated. Their soldiers had never seen real combat. They relied entirely on their technology, and when that technology failed against the swarm, they had nothing left. He changed the display to show human history, wars stretching back thousands of years, soldiers charging into certain death, cities burning and being rebuilt, nations falling and rising again. Humans have been fighting since we first learned to pick up rocks, Sam continued. We have never stopped. Every generation has known war. Every culture has warriors. We have spent our entire existence learning how to kill each other more efficiently. He paused and looked around the chamber. They see this as a weakness. They call us primitive and violent. But against the swarm, our violence may be the only thing that can save us. The debate continued for hours. Some representatives argued for isolation. Hopping the swarm would never find Earth. Others wanted to take the technology and use it to build defenses without getting involved in the war. A few suggested surrendering before the swarm even arrived. But slowly, a different voice emerged. It came from the military officers, from the representatives of nations that had known invasion and occupation, from people who understood what it meant to fight for survival. Commander Jake was allowed to address the council near the end of the session. He stood on the platform where admirals and politicians had spoken, just a ship captain with scars on his face and tired eyes. "I have a daughter," he said simply. "She is 23 years old. She works as a doctor. She has never known war, not really. Her generation grew up after the rebellion, after the worst of the fighting was over. They think peace is normal." He looked around the chamber. But peace is not normal. Peace is rare. Peace is something that has to be protected, fought for, sometimes died for. If we hide and hope the swarm passes us by, we are betting everything on luck. And if we lose that bet, my daughter and everyone like her will die without ever having a chance to fight back. Jake straightened his shoulders. "I am not asking anyone to throw their lives away. I am asking us to stand up while we still can, to choose our moment instead of having it chosen for us. That is all any soldier can ask for." The vote came at midnight. It was close, closer than Admiral Torres had hoped. But when the numbers were counted, the decision was clear. Earth would not hide. Earth would not run. Earth would stand with thee and face the swarm. Admiral Torres sent the response to Al personally. She kept it simple, as was her way. "Your people are welcome on Earth. Your enemies are now our enemies. Tell us what you need and we will find a way to provide it. We stand together or we fall alone." When Al received the message, he read it several times. He had expected negotiations, conditions, demands for payment. He had expected humans to act like every other species he had encountered, looking out for themselves first. Instead, they had chosen to fight a war that was not theirs, against an enemy they had never met, for allies they had only just learned existed. He did not understand. His people would never have done this. No species he had ever encountered would have done this. What kind of creatures were these humans? He would learn the answer soon enough, and it would terrify him more than the swarm ever had. Al's shuttle landed in the Nevada desert on a morning when the sun turned the sand to gold. He stepped out with 12 other scientists and military advisors who had volunteered for this mission. The air was thin and dry, nothing like the humid atmosphere of there, but they had prepared for this. What they had not prepared for was the heat. Captain Amy met them on the landing pad. She was 31 years old, with black hair tied back, and a uniform that looked like it had seen real use. She smiled when she saw the struggling with the temperature. "Welcome to Earth," she said. "You picked a hot day to arrive. Do not worry, the base has cooling systems." Al looked at her with his large black eyes. "This temperature is normal for your world. This is actually mild for summer here. It gets much hotter in some places." The scientist beside Al, a younger male named N, checked his scanner. The ultraviolet radiation levels are extremely high. How do your people survive exposure to this? Amy laughed. It was a strange sound to the sharp and sudden. We put on sunscreen and complain about the weather. Humans are adaptable. Come on, I will show you the base. The North American Defense Complex was built into the mountains, a massive facility that housed training grounds, research labs, and command centers. As Amy led the delegation through the corridors, they saw their first human soldiers up close. They were smaller than, weaker in appearance, with soft skin that bruised and bled easily. But they moved with a confidence that seemed out of place for such fragile creatures. They carried weapons that looked heavy, ran in the heat without complaint, and trained with an intensity that made it uncomfortable. They pushed themselves so hard, he whispered to Al. I have seen 3 of them collapse from exhaustion since we arrived, and yet they get up and continue. Al nodded slowly. I have read about this. Humans have a concept called discipline. They train their bodies to ignore pain and fatigue through repeated exposure. That sounds like torture. To us perhaps, to them it is normal. Amy brought them to an observation deck overlooking a training field. Below, a group of soldiers was running an obstacle course that looked designed to cause injury. They climbed walls, crawled through mud, swung across gaps, and fought each other with padded weapons. Some of them were bleeding. None of them stopped. Dr. Park joined them on the observation deck. He was the base psychologist, a man with a kind face and gentle voice that seemed strange in a military setting. He had been assigned to help them understand human behavior. You look disturbed, he said to Al. May I explain what you are seeing? Al gestured for him to continue, pointed to a soldier below who had just taken a hard hit to the ribs. The man was bent over, clearly in pain, but after a few seconds he straightened up and continued fighting. Humans have a chemical response to stress and danger, explained. We call it adrenaline. When a human perceives a threat, their body releases this chemical. It increases heart rate, sharpens focus, and temporarily blocks pain. In extreme situations, a human can continue functioning with injuries that would incapacitate most species. And looked horrified. You mean they can ignore their own bodies telling them to stop? Not just ignore, override. A human mother once lifted a vehicle weighing over 1,000 kilograms to save her child trapped underneath. Her muscles should not have been capable of that, but adrenaline made it possible. Al watched the training below with new eyes. Your people evolved this response. We evolved on a world filled with predators larger and stronger than us. We could not outrun them. We could not overpower them, so we developed other advantages: endurance, cooperation, and the ability to keep fighting long after we should have fallen. Over the following days, they learned more about humanity. They visited hospitals and saw how quickly humans recovered from injuries. They observed surgeons who cut open bodies to repair them, a concept that seemed barbaric until they saw the results. They watched athletes push themselves to exhaustion for games that meant nothing but pride. But it was human history that truly disturbed them. Amy took them to a museum in Washington, a building filled with artifacts from wars spanning thousands of years, swords and spears from ancient times, guns and cannons from the age of gunpowder, nuclear missiles from the era that nearly ended humanity. Al stood before a display showing photographs from something called the Second World War. He saw cities reduced to rubble, bodies stacked like firewood, and machines designed only to kill more efficiently. The numbers beside each photograph showed casualties in the millions. You did this to each other? He asked quietly. Amy nodded. Her voice was somber. Several times. We have come close to wiping ourselves out more than once. Nuclear weapons, biological weapons, environmental collapse. Each time we pulled back from the edge just in time. How does your species still exist? Amy thought for a moment before answering. Because no matter how badly we hurt each other, there are always people willing to rebuild, to forgive, to try again. We are not good at giving up. That night, Al sent a private message back to the High Council. His hands trembled as he wrote it. I have made a grave error in my assessment of humanity. They are not primitive. They are not weak. They are the most terrifying species I have ever encountered. They have survived horrors that would have destroyed any civilization. They have adapted to conditions that would kill us in hours, and they fight with a ferocity that defies all logic. I believe they may be able to stand against the swarm, but I am no longer certain that was a good thing to discover. We have invited monsters to fight monsters. May the stars forgive us for what we have unleashed. Eth came sooner than anyone expected. A scouting fleet of 200 ships emerged from hyperspace near, where humanity had built its furthest outpost. The station housed 3,000 civilians and 500 soldiers, a small community on the edge of explored space. Admiral Helen Torres received the alert on her flagship, the carrier Indomitable. She had 47 ships under her command, a mix of cruisers, destroyers, and fighter wings. Against 200 ETH vessels, the mathematics were clear. She was outnumbered more than 4 to 1. The advisor on her bridge, a tactical officer named Al, immediately recommended retreat. His 4 arms moved across his console as he spoke, pulling up charts and projections. Admiral, this is not a battle you can win. The station can be evacuated in 6 hours. If we withdraw now, we can save most of the civilian population. Torres did not look away from the main display, where the ETH fleet was forming into attack patterns. And then what? We fall back to the next system, and the next, until we are defending Earth itself. At least you would be alive to defend it. Torres turned to face him. Her eyes were hard, but her voice was calm. Al, I have read the reports from your worlds. Every time your people retreated, the swarm took more territory. They grew stronger while you grew weaker. That strategy failed you. We are going to try something different. She opened a channel to her fleet. All ships, this is Admiral Torres. The enemy has arrived. I know you can see the numbers. I know what they look like. But I want you to remember something. Every species the swarm has faced has run from them. Every species has tried to survive by avoiding battle, and every species has fallen. She paused, letting her words sink in. Today, we do not run. Today, we show them something new. We show them what happens when they push humans into a corner. All ships prepare to attack. Lieutenant Commander Nick Palmer sat in the cockpit of his strike cruiser, the Defiance. He was 26 years old, fresh out of officer training, and he had never fired a weapon in real combat. His hands were sweating inside his gloves, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But he had trained for this moment his entire adult life. He knew his ship, he knew his crew, and he trusted his admiral. The human fleet moved forward in a wedge formation, with the heavier ships at the front and the fighters ready to deploy on the flanks. The ETH fleet spread out to encircle them, a tactic that had worked against every enemy they had ever faced. They expected the humans to slow down, to form defensive lines, to try to protect themselves. Instead, the humans accelerated. Nick pushed his engines to full power, feeling the ship shudder around him. On his screen, he could see the ETH vessels growing larger every second. They were organic ships, grown rather than built, covered in dark armor that seemed to absorb light. They were terrifying. He did not care. All weapons ready, his tactical officer reported. Targets locked. Fire everything. The space between the fleets erupted with light. Missiles, rounds, and energy beams crossed the distance in seconds. The ETH returned fire, their weapons cutting through the void with sickly green light. Ships began to die on both sides. Nick saw the destroyer Valiant take a direct hit and break apart, its crew of 60 gone in an instant. He saw a ETH cruiser explode as human missiles found its reactor. He saw fighters swarming around larger vessels, their pilots dancing with death. The Defiance shook as enemy fire struck its hull. Alarms screamed. Damage reports flooded his screen. Nick ignored them all, focusing only on the enemy ship in front of him. Forward batteries, continuous fire. Do not stop until that thing is dead. On station, the ground battle was even more brutal. Boarding pods had punched through the station's hull, and now thousands of enemy soldiers were pouring into the corridors. They were creatures, each one standing 7 feet tall, with 4 arms ending in claws that could cut through steel. Sergeant Bate held at Junction 17 with 7 soldiers under her command. She was 34 years old, a veteran of the Mars Rebellion who had seen friends die and learned to keep fighting anyway. The junction was critical. If it fell, the enemy would have a clear path to the civilian shelters. "Hold the line," she shouted as the first wave of charged toward them. "Do not give them 1 inch." Her soldiers opened fire. The narrow corridor became a killing ground, filled with the sound of automatic weapons and the screams of dying aliens. But for every that fell, 2 more took its place. The battle lasted 6 hours. Bate watched her soldiers fall one by one. Private took a claw through the chest but kept firing until he bled out. Corporal Davis used his own body to shield a wounded comrade, buying her time to reload. Specialist held his position with a shattered leg, propped against the wall because he could no longer stand. When reinforcements finally broke through, Bate was the only one still on her feet. Her ammunition was exhausted. Her rifle was empty. She was fighting with a combat knife, covered in blood that was not entirely hers, standing on a pile of enemy dead. The reinforcement commander, a major named Alan Cross, stopped in his tracks when he saw her. He had served for 20 years and thought he had seen everything. He had never seen anything like this. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "you can stand down now. We have the junction." Bate looked at him with eyes that seemed to stare through him. Then she nodded slowly, the knife slipping from her fingers. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yes, we won." In space, the battle was ending. The human fleet had lost 31 ships and over 4,000 sailors, but the had lost their entire scouting force. 200 vessels destroyed, not one surviving to report what had happened. Admiral Torres looked at the debris field on her screen. She felt the weight of every life lost, a burden she would carry forever. But she also felt something else. Pride. They had done what no other species had ever done. They had stood their ground against the swarm and won. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the hive mind was receiving its first taste of fear. The hive mind existed in a state that no individual creature could understand. It was not one being but billions, all connected through a network of thought that spanned 1,000 worlds. It had consumed civilizations. It had ended species. It had spread across the galaxy like a plague, and nothing had ever slowed its advance. Until now. The data from the battle had flowed through the hive mind like poison. Every ship that had been destroyed had transmitted its final moments. Every soldier that had fallen had shared its death with the collective. The hive mind had experienced 200 losses simultaneously, a shock that rippled through its vast consciousness. But the deaths were not what disturbed it most. The hive mind had lost ships before, lost soldiers before. Losses were acceptable as long as the enemy was destroyed. What disturbed the hive mind was what the recordings showed about the humans. It studied the footage from boarding cameras, watching human soldiers fight in conditions that should have broken them. One recording showed a female soldier continuing to fire her weapon with 3 ribs shattered and blood filling her lung. Another showed a male pilot steering his crippled ship directly into a carrier, staying at the controls until the moment of impact. A third showed 7 humans holding a position against hundreds of swarm soldiers, dying one by one but never retreating. The hive mind analyzed the biology of these creatures. They were soft, fragile things. Their bones broke easily. Their organs were vulnerable. They required constant food, water, and sleep to function. By every measure, they should have been easy prey. But the data told a different story. Human bodies produced chemicals that temporarily enhanced their abilities far beyond normal limits. Their muscles could generate force that damaged themselves in the process, a design flaw that became an advantage in moments of crisis. Their brains could override pain signals, allowing them to function with wounds that would leave other species helpless. And there was something else, something the hive mind struggled to understand. Humans did not fight like rational creatures. They did not calculate odds and retreat when victory was impossible. They fought harder when cornered. They became more dangerous when wounded. They sacrificed themselves for others without hesitation. The hive mind searched its vast memory for any species that had shown similar behavior. It found none. In 10,000 years of conquest, it had never encountered beings like this. It began studying human history, accessing the records that they had provided to the swarm before their fall. What it found was almost incomprehensible. Humans had been fighting since before they had built their first cities. They had wars that lasted generations. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire world, and then they had used them on each other. They had committed acts of cruelty against their own kind that rivaled anything the swarm had ever done. And yet they survived. Every time they pushed themselves to the edge of extinction, they pulled back, they rebuilt, they learned, and then they found new ways to fight. The hive mind found a recording of something called the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 human warriors had held a narrow pass against an army of tens of thousands. They had known they would die. They had fought anyway, giving their lives to buy time for others. It found records of something called D-Day, where human soldiers had charged across open beaches into defensive fire, climbing over the bodies of their fallen companions to reach the enemy. The casualties were enormous. They did not stop. It found stories of individual humans performing acts that all logic. Soldiers throwing themselves onto explosive devices to save their companions. Pilots crashing their aircraft into enemy ships when their weapons failed. Mothers fighting off attackers with bare hands to protect their children. The hive mind reached a conclusion that changed everything. Humans were insane. Not in a metaphorical sense. In a very real, very dangerous sense. They did not think like other species. They did not value their own survival above all else. They were capable of choosing death, embracing death if they believed the cause was worthy. The hive mind had conquered 1,000 species by making them fear death more than anything else. That strategy would not work against humans. Humans had been dying for causes since before they had developed language. Death did not frighten them the way it frightened others. And worse, humans were aggressive. They did not simply defend. They attacked. They sought out enemies and destroyed them. If the swarm continued this war, humans would not stop at defending their own space. They would come looking for the hive mind itself. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Eth swarm called a halt to its advance. Ambassador Al received the transmission in the command center on Earth, where he had been working alongside Admiral Tors and Commander Jake. He read it 3 times before speaking. "They want to negotiate," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The swarm has never negotiated, not once in their entire history." Tors took the message and read it herself. The terms were simple. The swarm would withdraw from space. They would not approach Earth or any world under human protection. In return, they asked only for peace. Jake looked at the message over her shoulder. "They are afraid." Al shook his head slowly. "You do not understand. The swarm does not feel fear. They are a collective consciousness. Individual deaths mean nothing to them." "Then why are they running?" Al was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been wonder or might have been dread. "Because they have finally found something they cannot consume, something that fights back in ways they cannot predict or understand. They are not running from your weapons or your ships. They are running from you, from what you are. Admiral Tors considered the message for a long time. She thought about the soldiers who had died at station. She thought about the fleet she had sent into battle, knowing many would not return. She thought about the cost of war and the price of peace. Then she began composing her response. We accept your terms, but know this. If you ever threaten Earth or our allies again, we will not wait for you to come to us. We will we will hunt you across every star system you have ever touched, and we will teach you exactly what humanity is capable of when we have nothing left to lose. She sent the message and turned to face Al. The old ambassador was staring at her with an expression she could not read. You have done something remarkable today, he said quietly. You have saved my people and your own. You have stopped an enemy that had never been stopped before. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely audible. But I must confess something. When I first came to Earth, I thought we were asking primitives for help against monsters. Now I realize the truth. We were asking monsters for help against a force that could only be stopped by something more frightening than itself. Jake smiled, but there was no humor in it. We prefer the term survivors. Al watched as humans around the command center celebrated their victory, embracing each other, laughing and crying and doing all the strange things humans did when they felt strong emotions. They were so small, so fragile, so temporary. And yet they had made the greatest power in the galaxy turn and run. He understood now why the swarm had retreated. It was not because humans were strong. Many species were strong. It was not because humans were smart. Many species were smart. It was because humans simply did not know how to stop. And against an enemy like that, even the Eth swarm knew better than to fight.